Metro proudly presents green, brown, air, water, the ABCs of composting.
Every summer and fall, hundreds of people visit one of Metro's home composting demonstration sites to learn about composting. Why? Well, one reason is composting is a simple yet powerful way to make a difference in the way we live. Now, in Portland alone, about 1/3 of the trash from homes is yard debris and food waste that could be composted. If you've ever composted before, you know not using these materials is like, well, it's like throwing away gold. You see, compost is a very valuable material. Not only does it help us reduce the amount of yard debris and food waste sent to the landfill, but it also enriches our soil and makes a great mulch. So what exactly is this mysterious thing called compost? Well, compost is simply a dark, crumbly mixture of decomposed organic matter, like these grass clippings, leaves, twigs, and branches. The uses for finished compost are many.
In the Northwest, compost is especially helpful for improving clay soil. It breaks up the clay and allows water and the true nutrients held in the water to reach plant roots instead of remaining on the hard clay surface. To improve your soil, whatever the type, mix 2 to 5 inches of compost into vegetable and flower gardens each year before planting. You can also make a great potting mixture by adding 1 part compost to 2 parts commercial potting soil. And as a mulch, spread an inch or 2 around annual flowers and vegetables and up to 6 inches around trees and shrubs. Mulching will help minimize weeds and retain moisture during dry periods. To add nitrogen to your lawn, use compost as a top dressing. Just mix sifted compost with sand and sprinkle evenly over your lawns.
Once you've discovered the many uses of compost, you'll want to have a lot of it. And the good news is, it's easy to make. Well, that's because composting is the natural process of decomposition. So whether we help it along or not, decomposition will take place, just like it has for thousands of years. When we compost, we simply enhance the natural process by creating the ideal environment. The general recipe calls for green, brown, air, and water.
Decomposition happens when various microorganisms feed on compostable debris. The great part is they're not very picky eaters, so feeding them is not an exact science. The typical compost pile is teeming with hard-working composters. Bacteria is the first to break down the plant tissue, and by far the most numerous. They're joined by fungi and protozoan, with some help from centipedes, millipedes, beetles, and worms. When we compost, we speed up the natural process by making sure the conditions are right for the microorganisms. In turn, they create plenty of compost for us when we need it. These microorganisms work fastest if they have lots of surface area to feed on. So many composters chop or shred their yard debris with a chipper, lawnmower, or machete.
Our critter friends really do prefer a balanced diet. Feed them a combination of brown or carbon-rich materials like dried leaves and green nitrogen-rich debris like grass clippings. Exactly which amount of green and brown create the best results is a topic of debate among composters. Generally, it's 1 part brown, 2 parts green, but even a 50-50 mix will work fine.
There's no debate when it comes to our composter's menu. Grass clippings, leaves, plant stalks, hedge trimmings, old potting soil, twigs, annuals, weeds without seed heads, straw, coffee and coffee filters, and tea are all appreciated by our little friends. They also like fruit and vegetable scraps, but these need to be handled carefully. We'll talk about that later.
We don't recommend adding diseased plants, weeds with seed heads, pet feces, dead animals, breads and grains, meat or fish parts, dairy products, or any greasy or oily foods. They can create a variety of unpleasant problems. All these guidelines are general, but even if you don't follow the recipe exactly, your compost pile will create a good compost. It may just take a little longer. Now, let's get started and build a pile. A good way to start is by layering the materials about 4 to 6 inches deep. If you run out of brown, you can substitute straw or chip twigs or branches. Alternate between green and brown until you fill the pile at least 3 feet by 3 feet. If you run out of green, alfalfa pellets or a handful of nitrogen-rich fertilizer are good additions. You can also dump in green and brown and mix with a pitchfork. Now, once you've built a pile, you can continue to add materials to the pile whenever you please. If you get bigger than 5 feet and you don't turn the pile, it won't allow enough air to reach the center of the pile, and you may then end up with a smelly anaerobic compost pile. Okay, we've talked about the roles of green and brown. What about air and water? How do they affect the pile? Well, adding air to the pile helps the compost cook at a high temperature and controls the odors. The pile should have a pleasant woodsy odor. Not enough air is commonly the cause of a stinky compost pile. Luckily, air can be added by simply turning the materials. Also, many bin designs allow air to enter even without turning.
You also need to add water so the pile stays about as damp as a wrung-out sponge. Allowing the pile to dry out or get too wet will slow down the composting process.
Either way, fast or slow, you'll end up with finished usable compost. Which composting method you use depends on how much time you have, what materials you want to compost, and how fast you want to create your compost. 3 of the main styles are holding units, like the one we just used, turning units, which are designed for people who want to turn their compost regularly, and direct land application. This is one kind of turning unit, a 3-bin system. Turning units let you mix in air and hot compost.
Hot, fast compost piles are efficient and provide a quality compost because high temperatures destroy weed seeds, many plant diseases, and break down most pesticide residue. Hot composting also allows you to add fruit and vegetable scraps without risk of creating odors and attracting pests.
You'll get compost fast with this technique, but you'll also have to invest the most effort. This 3-bin system, when properly used, provides finished compost in about 3 to 6 weeks. As with all hot composting, it's important to maintain a proper balance of brown, carbon, and green nitrogen material. It should be at least a 50-50 mix. Chop or shred the material to provide a lot of surface area. Regularly check the moisture level, and finally, turn the pile weekly to maintain good aeration. This creates the ideal temperature for the most efficient decomposing bacteria. These piles typically get pretty steamy, reaching between 110 and 160 degrees. When the green, brown, air, water recipe is followed to perfection, the results are amazing.
Other turning methods include barrel composters. These handle small amounts of material and compost in batches, so you can't add any new material until the batch is done, usually in 3 to 6 weeks. One easy way to make a 2-bin system is with concrete blocks. A 2-bin system handles a large amount of material, is less effort than a 3-bin system, but takes a bit longer to get the final product, 2 to 3 months. You can build this with about 50 blocks. To speed up the process, some people like to use activators. You can buy these compost starters at garden centers or simply use a shovelful of soil or finished compost to activate your pile. All 3 of these methods activate your compost pile by adding microorganisms, and as we now know, the more microorganisms in the pile, the faster the pile will decompose.
Holding units are extremely popular because they demand the least amount of time on your part. They're called holding units because, well, that's what they do. Hold your yard debris and allow it to decompose slowly without a lot of turning. The only shortfall is it will take longer to create a finished product, as long as a year. Now, bins are not even needed, although they keep piles neat and less accessible to pets and children. Bins also tend to allow you to build the pile up and allow more air to move through the pile.
A few examples of holding units are round wire bins, which are easy to make and have a large capacity, and bins made from old fencing or wooden pellets that can be used at virtually no cost.
And finally, the easiest of all composting techniques is direct land application. This passive method is useful for relatively small amounts of waste. Examples include burying fruit and vegetable scraps in a hole and covering with 8 inches of soil, and tilling grass clippings, leaves, and soft garden waste directly into garden beds. Even though composting is a simple, easy-to-follow process, sometimes you can run into some trouble. If your compost pile does not heat up, there are a few things you can do.
Check to see if the pile is about as damp as a wrung-out sponge. If it's too wet, add dry absorbent material by turning it in. Sawdust or dry leaves work really well. If the pile is too dry, simply water with a hose. If your pile doesn't have enough nitrogen, it will not heat up. Add grass clippings, nitrogen-rich fertilizer, or packaged manure and turn them in to increase the temperature. If your compost pile has an ammonia odor, it could be from having too much grass clippings or other nitrogen-rich material, or not enough air. Turn the pile to add air, add carbon material such as leaves or sawdust.
By following the steps outlined in this video, you shouldn't have any problems with pests. Just remember, no meat or fatty food scraps. This will help avoid a bad-smelling pile that attracts pests. On the whole, you can avoid most of these problems if you follow the recipe of green, brown, air, water. Composting really is quite simple and very rewarding. Now, if you're interested in learning more about composting firsthand, visit one of Metro's home composting demonstration sites in the Portland metro area.
To request a workshop schedule or get directions to a site, call Metro Recycling Information at 234-3000. The centers are located at Fulton Community Gardens, Leach Botanical Gardens, Clackamas Community College, Mount Hood Community College, and a smaller demonstration site is located at the Metro Washington Park Zoo.
Visit any one of the centers and take a self-guided tour, or attend free weekend workshops which are offered during spring and fall. In the meantime, keep composting, and remember, green, brown, air, and water. That's all it takes.